on stage, there's 5,000 people out there coughing and sneezing and laughing and cheering.
For more than 60 years, Cliff Richard convinced the world he was the safest man in entertainment. The smiling Christian gentleman trusted by parents, embraced by royalty, and protected by one of the cleanest reputations show business had ever seen. But behind that carefully controlled image was a private life filled with hidden struggles, painful controversies, and rumors that followed him for decades. Because while Cliff spent his entire career insisting marriage was never for him, he quietly shared his homes and personal life with mysterious companions for over 30 years, raising questions that never fully disappeared. Why did Cliff Richard never get married? What was really happening behind the scenes of his carefully protected world? Cliff Richard's public persona. Cliff Richard has been famous for so long that most people cannot remember a time when his name was not part of British culture. He sold more records than almost anyone in history, became the first pop star to receive a knighthood, and built a reputation as the cleanest, safest, most reliable entertainer of his generation. For 60 years, the public saw exactly what he wanted them to see. But behind that carefully crafted image, Cliff Richard was living another life entirely, a secret existence that remained hidden for more than 3 decades. Cliff Richard was not Britain's first rock and roll star, but he was the first one who mattered. In August of 1958, he released a song called Move It, and music historians have pointed to that single as the moment when British rock and roll finally came into its own. Even John Lennon, who knew something about the birth of rock music, later said that Move It was the first genuine British rock record. Before Cliff Richard, British teenagers were listening to American artists like Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. After Cliff Richard, they had a star of their own, someone who looked like them, sounded like them, and understood what they wanted to hear. The charts proved that the public agreed. Cliff Richard went on to become the 3rd top-selling singles artist in the history of the United Kingdom, positioned behind only the Beatles and Elvis Presley. That is remarkable company for anyone, but for a singer who started his career as a raw, leather-jacketed rocker, it was almost unbelievable. He achieved a milestone that no other singer has ever matched. He scored a UK #1 single in 5 consecutive decades, from the 1950s through the 1990s. That means he was topping the charts when parents were listening to vinyl records and when their grandchildren were buying CDs. Over the course of his career, he amassed more than 130 singles, albums, and EPs that reached the UK Top 20, translating to more than 250 million records sold worldwide. Those numbers put him in the same league as the biggest names in music history. But Cliff Richard was never just a singer. He was a multimedia entertainer in an era before that term even existed. He transitioned from raw rock and roll to family-friendly movie stardom, leading top-grossing British musical films such as The Young Ones in 1961 and Summer Holiday in 1963. These movies were not critically acclaimed masterpieces, but audiences loved them. They featured catchy songs, pretty scenery, and a wholesome energy that made parents feel comfortable letting their children watch. The rebellious teenager who had snarled through Move It was gone, replaced by a clean-cut young man who smiled for the cameras and never caused any trouble. Television cemented his place in British homes. Cliff Richard hosted multiple flagship BBC variety series, including It's Cliff Richard, which ran from 1970 to 1974. These shows were appointment viewing for millions of families, the kind of programming that brought generations together around the same screen. Grandparents, parents, and children all watched Cliff Richard, and they all felt good about watching him. He was not controversial or dangerous. He was comfort food in the form of a pop star. He also represented the United Kingdom twice in the Eurovision Song Contest, finishing second in 1968 with Congratulations and third in 1973 with Power to All Our Friends. Eurovision was the perfect platform for his brand of safe, accessible pop music, and his strong showings reminded the world that Britain could produce stars who could compete on an international stage without embarrassing anyone. The most significant turning point in Cliff Richard's public persona came in 1964, at the absolute peak of his commercial power. He publicly announced his conversion to born-again Christianity, a decision that would define the rest of his career. He actively aligned his public persona with global evangelism, regularly appearing as a guest speaker and musical performer at massive Billy Graham crusades throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Billy Graham was the most famous Christian evangelist in the world, and sharing a stage with him gave Cliff Richard a legitimacy that no other pop star could claim. The conversion changed everything about how Cliff Richard presented himself to the public. He refused film roles or musical styles that conflicted with his faith, deliberately shedding his early leather-jacketed rebel look for a clean-cut image that emphasized kindness, humility, and moral uprightness. He stopped singing about teenage rebellion and started singing about faith, hope, and love. His audience aged with him, and the new fans he attracted were drawn to his wholesomeness rather than his edge. The establishment took notice. In 1995, Cliff Richard became the first pop star to be honored with a knighthood for services to charity and music. The transformation was complete. The counterculture youth figure who had once represented teenage rebellion had become an establishment icon, someone who could stand alongside statesmen and royalty without seeming out of place. Queen Elizabeth II herself bestowed the honor, and the photograph of that moment symbolized everything that Cliff Richard had become. Perhaps the single moment that best captured his public reputation came during a 1996 Wimbledon rain delay. The tennis tournament was paused, the crowds were restless, and the broadcasters needed something to fill the time. Cliff Richard, who was sitting in the royal box, stood up and spontaneously began singing "Singing in the Rain" unaccompanied. The cameras captured it, and for millions of viewers, that moment solidified his reputation as a reliable, unshakable professional who could be counted on to deliver charm and warmth in any situation. That was the Cliff Richard the public knew. But behind the smiles and the songs, there was another Cliff Richard, a private man living a secret life that would have shocked the fans who had grown up watching him. For 31 years, he kept that secret hidden. And when the truth finally came out, it raised questions that no one had ever thought to ask. The darkness the media didn't always see. The first battles Cliff Richard fought were about money, though no one outside the industry knew it at the time. Cliff Richard suffered massive financial drainage early in his career due to highly unfavorable standard industry contracts. The record labels and managers who controlled the business in the late 1950s and early 60s were not in the habit of being generous to young artists. Cliff Richard received only a tiny fraction of his early record and merchandise earnings, while the people around him got rich. He was working harder than almost anyone in show business, performing up to 3 shows a night under the demands of his early management, and seeing very little of the money that his name was generating. The schedule left him physically exhausted and left little room for a personal life or mental health recovery. He was young, famous, and broke, a combination that no one would have guessed from watching his smiling face on television. The cultural backlash against his Christian faith was even harder to endure. Cliff Richard encountered harsh derision from music critics and contemporary rock peers who labeled his faith as uncool, artificial, or hypocritical. In the rock and roll world of the 1960s and 70s, the musicians who were celebrated were the ones who drank, took illicit substances, and lived on the edge. Cliff Richard, who refused to do any of those things, was dismissed as a novelty or a joke by the people who controlled the critical conversation. The criticism eventually got to him, and he suffered a deep internal identity crisis in the late 1960s. He seriously considered retiring from secular show business permanently to become a full-time religious education teacher. The man who would later become Sir Cliff Richard almost walked away from music entirely because the criticism of his faith became too painful to ignore. Tax controversies followed. In the 1970s, the United Kingdom's top-rate income tax spiked to levels that made it almost impossible for wealthy entertainers to keep what they earned. Cliff Richard, like many other successful British musicians, faced severe public and political scrutiny over his financial management. He was accused of abandoning his home country when he began strategically spending chunks of the year abroad, eventually establishing residency in Barbados and Portugal to protect his assets and minimize his UK tax exposure. The tabloids painted him as someone who loved Britain only when it was convenient. The reality was more complicated. He was trying to protect the money he had earned through decades of hard work. But the public did not want to hear about the complicated tax laws that made his relocation necessary. They just saw a rich man leaving. The anti-establishment clashes continued into the late 1990s. In 1999, Cliff Richard recorded a song called The Millennium Prayer, a religious track that he believed would resonate with audiences as the calendar turned to a new century. The song was not rock and roll or pop. It was a prayer set to music, and major British radio stations, including BBC Radio 1, refused to play it. They blacklisted the song because they said it did not fit their format. But the public disagreed. The demand for The Millennium Prayer was so massive that it drove the song to #1 on the charts without any radio support. Cliff Richard had beaten the system, but the experience left him frustrated and bitter. He had spent 40 years in the music business, and the gatekeepers were still trying to shut him out. The media also criticized him for his public statements opposing liberal social shifts. As British society became more progressive, Cliff Richard's traditionalist viewpoints began to seem out of step. He was not trying to be controversial. He was simply stating what he believed, the same way he had always done. But the world had changed, and he had not changed with it. The disconnect between his values and the values of the mainstream entertainment industry grew wider with each passing year. The man who had once been celebrated as a national treasure was now being dismissed as an old-fashioned relic. These were the battles that the public mostly missed. These struggles did not make it into the cheerful interviews or the nostalgic documentaries. The darkness behind the public persona was real, but it was not the darkness that would eventually bring him down. That darkness was something else entirely. A scandal so terrible, it completely changed his life. The scandal that traumatized Cliff Richard. Cliff Richard's greatest nightmare began with a historical claim made to the Metropolitan Police. Someone alleged that Cliff had been involved in a disturbing and inappropriate conduct at a Billy Graham evangelical event in 1985. The claim sat in the files for years before anyone paid attention to it. Then, in July of 2014, the case was handed over to South Yorkshire Police. The transfer happened because police forces across Britain were re-examining old claims under the shadow of the Jimmy Savile scandal. The police were under immense pressure to investigate every old allegation, no matter how thin the evidence. Cliff Richard's name had been included in that sweep, even though he had never been charged with the crime. What happened next would have been unbelievable if it were not so well documented. BBC reporter Dan Johnson obtained a tip from a confidential police source about the Cliff Richard investigation. Someone inside the police department had leaked the information to the journalist, and that leak set off a chain of events that would destroy Cliff Richard's reputation for years. The BBC began pressuring the South Yorkshire Police, insisting that they would publish the allegations against Cliff Richard early, whether the police liked it or not. The police, fearing that an early publication would compromise their investigation, agreed to provide the broadcaster with the exact timing of the Cliff Richard property search they were planning. On August 14, 2014, while Cliff Richard was at his vineyard property in Portugal, detectives executed a search warrant at his apartment in Sunningdale, Berkshire. The search itself was bad enough. What made it a nightmare was the BBC's response. The network deployed an overhead news helicopter and ground crews to film the raid live. Cameras zoomed through the windows to broadcast detectives going through his personal drawers and papers on national television. Millions of people watched as police officers rifled through Cliff Richard's belongings, searching for evidence of a crime that had been alleged but not proven. Cliff Richard was not in the country when his home was raided. He learned about it from news reports, watching from Portugal as his private life was torn apart on television. The image of that helicopter hovering over his apartment, the cameras zooming in on his bedroom, and the detectives opening his drawers was burned into the public consciousness. And for 2 years, he had to live with that image hanging over him. He was kept under active investigation for 22 months, nearly 2 full years of not knowing whether he would be charged with a crime. During that time, he was interviewed under caution, meaning that anything he said could be used against him in court. But he was never arrested, never detained, and never formally charged with any crime. The investigation dragged on, and the media coverage never stopped. Every few months, a new story would appear, reminding the public that Cliff Richard was under investigation for something terrible. In June of 2016, the Crown Prosecution Service officially closed the case. The statement was clear and definitive. There was insufficient evidence to prosecute. After 22 months of investigation, after the helicopter raid and the television broadcast and the non-stop media coverage, there was not enough evidence to even bring him to trial. The case was over. Cliff Richard had been publicly humiliated for a crime that the authorities themselves admitted they could not prove. But Cliff Richard was not content to simply walk away. He filed a massive civil lawsuit against both South Yorkshire Police and the BBC, charging them with gross misuse of private information. The police quickly admitted fault. In May of 2017, South Yorkshire Police conceded legal liability, issued an official apology, and settled out of court by paying Cliff Richard £400,000 in damages. The BBC fought harder, but they lost. The High Court verdict came in 2018. Mr. Justice Mann ruled heavily against the BBC, determining that a suspect has a reasonable expectation of privacy during a police investigation before a formal charge is made. The ruling was a landmark decision that changed how British media could report on ongoing investigations. The court awarded Cliff Richard £210,000 in general damages. In 2019, the BBC agreed to pay an additional £2 million to cover his legal costs. But here is the part that most people do not know. Despite winning the lawsuit, the entire case took a massive toll on Cliff Richard's finances. He had spent more than £4 million of his own money on the legal battle. The damages and cost awards did not even cover what he had paid. He won the war, but he lost a fortune fighting it. The scandal that traumatized Cliff Richard did not end with the court verdict. It left scars that would never fully heal. And it opened the door to questions about his private life that he had spent decades trying to avoid. Why Cliff Richard never married? Throughout his career, one question has constantly followed Cliff Richard. Why did he never marry? Richard himself had a ready answer, and he had been giving it for years. He intentionally marketed a song called Bachelor Boy as a signature anthem, embedding his single status directly into his commercial brand. The song was catchy and lighthearted, and fans accepted it as a charming quirk rather than a confession. But behind the music, Cliff had given serious thought to marriage, and he had come to a conclusion that surprised some people. He stated publicly that while he came close to walking down the aisle twice, he ultimately realized that his career dominance and his obsessive dedication to his fans would make him an impossible and unfair husband. He believed that no woman deserved to be married to a man who was already married to his work. That did not mean he lived like a monk. Cliff Richard maintained widely documented, brief romantic attachments with prominent women over the years. He was linked to actress Una Stubbs, who was famous for her roles in British television and film. He dated dancer Jackie Irving for a period. Most notably, he had a public relationship with tennis star Sue Barker in 1982, a pairing that delighted the tabloids because both were beloved British celebrities. These relationships were real, or at least they appeared to be, but none of them progressed to marriage. Cliff always found a reason to step back before making a permanent commitment. Then there was Bill Latham, a name that confused some of Cliff's fans because Latham was a man. Cliff met Latham, a religious education teacher, in the mid-1960s. The timing was significant because Latham quickly became a primary driver behind Cliff's public conversion to Christianity. He was not just a friend, he was a spiritual guide and a trusted advisor. For more than 30 years, Latham lived full-time with Cliff in his Surrey mansion, acting as his property manager, personal assistant, and core management advisor. The arrangement was unusual enough that the tabloids could not stop speculating about it. They printed endless theories about what might be going on behind the closed doors of the Surrey mansion. Cliff handled the speculation in a way that was both clever and unexpected. To diffuse decades of intense press speculation about their living arrangement, Cliff revealed in 2008 that Bill Latham's long-term girlfriend had actually lived in the house alongside them for the entire duration of that period. He was not living alone with another man. He was living with a couple, two people who were in a committed relationship with each other. The revelation did not silence all the rumors, but it made it much harder for the tabloids to keep printing the same old stories. The arrangement ended smoothly in the early 2000s when Latham and his partner moved out to establish their own private home. After Latham left, Cliff found himself living alone for the first time in decades, and he did not like it. In 2001, while in New York City, he met John Macklin, an American Roman Catholic missionary priest. The two men became friends, and over time, Macklin began to confide in Cliff about his struggles. He was burned out. The demands of his parish duties had exhausted him, and he was not sure he could continue. Cliff made a suggestion that changed both of their lives. He told Macklin to take a sabbatical from his priestly duties and come help manage Cliff's extensive international properties. The priest agreed, and suddenly, Cliff had a new companion living in his home. In his 2008 autobiography, My Life, My Way, Cliff officially defined Macklin as his companion. He explained that he despised living alone and that he valued having someone trusted to look after his properties while he traveled. The word companion was carefully chosen, and it sparked another round of speculation. Cliff did not seem to care. He had spent his entire career being asked about his private life, and he was tired of playing the game. By the late 2000s, Cliff Richard had grown weary of the media's obsession with his private life. He wrote that he was sick to death of the invasive questions, arguing that private, consenting individual lives are nobody else's business. He did not owe the public an explanation for who he loved or how he lived. But then he went further. In his autobiography, he used his platform to explicitly call out the church, stating that the institution must modernize and approve same-sex marriages to recognize loving commitment as it exists today. For a man who had built his career on a wholesome Christian image, this was a striking statement. The questions about Cliff Richard's private life will probably never stop. There are too many decades of speculation, too many tabloid headlines, and too many fans who feel entitled to know everything about the people they admire. But Cliff has made his position clear. He never married because he believed he would be a bad husband. He lived with Bill Latham and then with John McKeelan because he did not want to be alone. And he believes that what happens to him in private is nobody's business but their own. That is the answer he gives. Whether people accept it is up to them. But after 8 decades of life, the question that really matters now is not about who Cliff Richard loved. It is about how he is doing today, at 85 years old, and whether his body is holding up better than his reputation. Why Cliff Richard disappeared from public life. The truth is that Cliff Richard did not choose to disappear from public life. His body made the choice for him. The immense chronic stress of the 2014 police raid and the years of investigation that followed triggered a severe aggressive case of neurological shingles across his face and head. Shingles is a painful condition caused by the same virus that brings chickenpox, and when it attacks the nerves of the face, it can be devastating. Doctors warned Cliff that the rash was tracking down his forehead and stood a high chance of permanently blinding him if it compromised his eyes. He spent months not knowing whether he would lose his sight. The shingles also caused drastic, sudden physical weight loss and muscle wastage during the investigation, leaving him visibly frail and physically unable to perform. The man who had danced across stages for 50 years could barely get out of bed. During that period, Cliff entered what he described as a total creative limbo that lasted 2 solid years. He pulled out of planned concerts, paused album recordings, and stepped completely away from the public eye. The reason was simple. He did not want to be treated like live bait by reporters who were still writing stories about the investigation. He had spent his entire career loving the spotlight, but now the spotlight felt like a weapon. He told friends that he could not sing because he could not breathe, and he could not breathe because the stress had closed up his chest. The man who had once performed 3 shows in a single night was now struggling to walk to his own mailbox. The contamination of his home made everything worse. Cliff stated in court that his primary UK property in Sunningdale felt permanently violated by the televised raid. He could not look at the rooms without seeing the cameras zooming through his windows. He could not walk down the hallway without remembering the detectives opening his drawers. He refused to live there ever again. After the incident, he returned to the flat for a mere 5 minutes, just long enough to pack essentials before selling it off. A home that had been his sanctuary for years was now a crime scene in his memory, and he could not stay there another night. As if the shingles and the trauma were not enough, Cliff also faced a prostate cancer diagnosis. The disease was caught early during a routine medical checkup prior to scheduling a tour, and it remained contained without spreading. But the diagnosis was another reminder that his body was not what it used to be. He underwent treatment, recovered, and has since been given a clean bill of health. But the scare left its mark. Cliff has openly stated that his lower public visibility is a natural consequence of aging. He is deep into his 80s now, and he requires extended periods of rest, quiet time, and physical peace. The non-stop touring schedule of his youth is no longer possible, and he has made peace with that. The grief of losing old friends has also taken a toll. In December of 2022, Bill Latham, the religious education teacher who had lived with Cliff for more than 30 years and helped shape his Christian faith, died at the age of 84. Cliff was devastated. Latham had been more than a friend. He had been a confidant, a manager, and a brother in every way that mattered. His death reinforced something that Cliff had been feeling for years. He hated being alone. He hated the silence of empty rooms. He hated that so many of the people he loved were gone. Today, Cliff Richard avoids the UK mainstream media landscape almost entirely. He has permanently split his retirement days between his estates in Barbados and Portugal, two countries where the paparazzi are less aggressive and the weather is kinder to aging bones. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.